Have you ever noticed that even trying to do the right thing, there is something inside your mind that insists on pulling you to the opposite side, as if there is a silent force sabotaging your deepest thoughts? Those moments when you lay your head on the pillow and, instead of peace, find a whirlwind of memories, worries, and inner voices that won't shut up, as if your own mind has become a strange place, hard to control and impossible to silence. It's as if time slowed down in those instants. Every thought echoes louder, every worry gains weight, and what seemed small during the day grows into the darkness of the night. You try to change the focus, you try to pray, you try to take a deep breath, but something always comes back, like a cycle that repeats itself endlessly. And deep down, a question arises that few have the courage to admit. Why, even though I seek God, does my mind still seem so far from the peace He promises? What almost no one has told you is that there is a spiritual reason for this. Something hidden between the lines of Jesus' teachings, a key that is not on the surface, but that has always been accessible to those who learn to see beyond the obvious. It's not about trying harder, nor about fighting harder. There is a different path, a way of aligning the mind that changes everything, but remains invisible to the majority. What if I told you that this restlessness is not the end, but the sign that something needs to be revealed? That there is a way to completely transform this internal battlefield into a place of peace, direction, and God's presence. And that it starts at such a simple point that many ignore. There is a spiritual code present in the Scriptures, taught in a subtle way by Jesus, that when understood, changes the way you think, feel, and live. It's not complicated, but it's also not something you learn by listening roughly. It's profound, it's transformative, and most of all, it's real. Stay until the end, because what will be revealed here is not theory. It is a living secret that can begin to act within your mind today, in a way that you will not be able to ignore. On this path that we are starting together, you will realize that it is not just about controlling thoughts, but about completely transforming the way your mind responds to life. As you move forward, profound teachings of Jesus will be revealed that show how God works in the invisible, exactly where His most important decisions are born. You will understand how to free your mind from patterns that have been repeating for years, how to develop a peace that does not depend on circumstances, and how to listen to God's voice even in the midst of the inner noise. At each step, something inside you begins to adjust, as if forgotten pieces finally fall into place. And there's a reason you're here now. So, if this message has already started to speak to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and allow this truth to reach even more lives. For as it is written, for as he hath thought in his soul, so it is. Proverbs 23:7. Now begins the most delicate part of this whole journey, because you need to understand something that completely changes the way you see your own mind. It's not just a place where thoughts appear and disappear without control. Your mind is an altar, and that changes everything, because an altar is never empty. He is always occupied by something or someone. The question that almost no one asks is, what has been occupying the altar of your mind every day? In the Old Testament, the altar was the holiest place, where man met God through sacrifice. It was not a common space. It was separated, consecrated, treated with reverence. Now think deeply. If your mind is that altar, what thoughts have you put there? What ideas have you allowed to remain? Because everything you repeat internally begins to gain strength, begins to take root, until it becomes something that governs your decisions without you realizing it. Maybe you've experienced this without realizing it. A small, almost innocent thought that was repeated, and suddenly it turned into fear, or a doubt that seemed fleeting, but over time became a silent belief that began to limit their attitudes. This is how cycles are formed. Thoughts become beliefs, beliefs become actions, and actions build entire destinies. Abraham understood this on a deep level. Before any miracle happened, before any promise was fulfilled, something had already been established within his mind. He chose to believe, even when everything around him said otherwise. There were no signs, there was no proof, there was no logic, but there was an internal, firm, silent, powerful decision. He honored God first in the mind, and only later did he see reality transform. And here's the point that few see. What dominates your mind today is shaping your tomorrow. It's not just your visible actions, but what you accept to think about every day. When misaligned thoughts come in and find space, they don't stay neutral. They open doors to fear, anxiety, confusion, and little by little, they are occupying the place that should be of God's truth. That is why there is an urgent call for vigilance. It's not about living in tension, but in awareness. Watching what comes in, filtering out what remains, deciding what is allowed to grow within you. Because when the mind ceases to be dominated by the world and is governed by the truth of God, something begins to reorganize itself inside. Peace ceases to be occasional and becomes constant. Clarity begins to replace confusion. Above all that is to be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it come the springs of life. Proverbs 4:23. And if somehow this truth is stirring you right now, as if something is being revealed within you, don't ignore it. Perhaps this is the moment when God is touching the very area that needs to be transformed. If you felt this, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of a change that you can't even imagine. Now there is an even deeper level that needs to be revealed, because it is not only conscious thoughts that shape your life, but especially those that no one sees, not even the people closest to you. They are the hidden, silent thoughts that go unnoticed during the day, but which carry a much greater spiritual weight than they seem. And this is exactly where many are mistaken, believing that only visible attitudes matter, when in fact Jesus made it clear that everything begins much earlier within the mind. He revealed something that breaks any illusion of external control, showing that sin is not born in action, but in hidden intention. That which you secretly nourish, that which you allow to grow within you without resistance, is already producing effects, even if no one notices. Thoughts of envy, pride, fear, or disordered desires do not remain neutral. They contaminate, distort, weaken spiritual sensitivity, and create a silent distance between you and God's presence. Maybe you felt it without knowing how to explain it. A restlessness, a loss of peace, a feeling that something is not right, even when everything seems normal on the outside. This happens because the mind begins to load content that has not been filtered, and little by little, what seemed small begins to dominate larger spaces. It is like an invisible seed that grows in the dark without making noise, but with a deep impact. David's story reveals this process in an intense and real way. It didn't start with a big mistake. It started with a look, with a thought that wasn't interrupted. Instead of rejecting it immediately, he allowed that thought to remain, to grow, to take shape. And what was just something internal turned into a sequence of decisions that brought painful consequences. It all started in the mind. And that's exactly why honoring God in this place is so essential. But there is something powerful in this same story that many ignore. When David realized what had happened, he didn't try to hide it from God. He broke himself, humbled himself, recognized his failure deeply. This reveals that while wrong thoughts can drive us away, sincere repentance has the power to restore fellowship. God does not seek instant perfection, but a heart willing to align again. And here's a principle you need to keep. What you feed grows. If you entertain thoughts that do not come from God, they will grow stronger. But if you begin to reject what does not edify and decide to nurture that which comes from the truth, your mind begins to transform from the inside out. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman with an unclean intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:28. If this word is awakening something within you, as if God is showing areas that need adjustment, don't ignore this moment. Comment now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." Write it as a sincere prayer and also leave your like, because this simple gesture can take this message to someone who needs exactly that today. There is a point where many people get lost because they believe that changing the mind is just a matter of trying to think better, as if it were enough human effort to resolve a spiritual conflict. But the truth is deeper and at the same time more confronting. The renewal of the mind does not happen by attempt. It happens by transformation. And transformation requires exchange. It's not about adding positive thoughts on top of the old ones. It's about removing what is a lie and replacing it with God's truth. Maybe you've tried to control your thoughts and realized that no matter how hard you try, they come back. This is because the mind does not remain empty. When something leaves, something else needs to take its place. And this is exactly where the spiritual process that few understand begins. Renewing the mind is a continuous exercise of substitution. Every thought that does not come from God needs to be confronted, questioned, and exchanged for what the Word declares to be true. Paul is one of the strongest examples of this transformation. Before his encounter with God, his mind was completely convinced of something that actually led him away from the truth. He believed he was right, but he was deeply mistaken. Until, at an unexpected moment, everything changed. It wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a change in mind. What he thought, defended, and believed was confronted by divine truth. And from that meeting, his way of seeing life was never the same. This reveals something powerful. No matter how long a pattern has been inside you, it can be broken when the truth comes in hard enough. But this process does not happen automatically. It requires decision, discipline, and constancy. To honor God in the mind is to choose every day to feed what comes from Him. It is to make room for the Word, even when the will does not come. It is to remain in communion, even when it seems difficult, because the mind needs to be nourished correctly to remain steadfast. And this path involves internal confrontation. There are thoughts that need to be exposed, patterns that need to be abandoned, and beliefs that need to be reconstructed. It's like a silent reformation, where God removes old structures and raises up something new, more solid, more aligned with who you were really called to be. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Ephesians 4:23. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is recognizing that this process has already begun, even if in a small way. If this made sense to you, write in the comments a simple phrase, but full of truth. My mind belongs to God. Sometimes declaring this is the first step to living this transformation in a real way. There is a detail that can completely change the way you see your own thoughts, and perhaps no one has explained it to you clearly until today. Not everything that crosses your mind comes from you, and not everything that seems good really comes from God. This is one of the most delicate points of spiritual life, because many end up accepting ideas, feelings, and impulses without questioning the origin, as if everything were natural, when in fact there is an urgent need for discernment. To discern is to learn to separate. It is to develop a spiritual sensitivity capable of identifying what edifies and what destroys, what brings us closer to God and what silently distances us. Because deception rarely presents itself in an obvious way. It often arrives disguised, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a thought that seems logical, but that carries doubt, fear, or confusion. And if it is not identified, it begins to create space within the mind. That is why honoring God in the mind requires active vigilance. It is not to live distrusting everything, but to live consciously. Observe what arises, filter what remains, and decide what deserves to grow within you. This process is not automatic, it needs to be developed. And the closer you get to God, the more sensitive your mind becomes to perceiving that which is not in line with the truth. Jesus showed this clearly when he was led into the wilderness. He faced not only external temptations, but internal suggestions, thoughts that tried to distort his identity and his purpose. And the most impressive thing is that the proposals did not seem absurd at first glance. They were accompanied by arguments, logic, and a semblance of a solution. But Jesus did not negotiate with that. He answered every attempt with the Word of God. This reveals a powerful principle. The mind can only be protected when it is grounded in truth. It is not enough to feel, it is not enough to find, it is not enough to suppose. It is necessary to have a firm foundation. When you know the truth, you begin to recognize what does not come from it. And what previously went unnoticed now becomes evident. Maybe you've experienced times when something seemed right, but deep down there was a discomfort that was difficult to explain. This is a sign that your spiritual sensitivity was trying to warn you. And the more you develop that discernment, the faster you identify what needs to be rejected before it takes root. Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see if they are of God. 1 John 4:1. If you've made it this far, it's no accident. There is something being adjusted within you, something that is being awakened in a silent but profound way. And that's just the beginning. At the end of this path, let's enter a time of prayer that can strengthen your mind in a way that words alone can't explain. So stay with me until the end, because that might be the turning point you've been waiting for. There is something that may be preventing you from hearing God's direction clearly, and it is not a lack of faith, nor an absence of prayer. It is the excess of noise within your own mind. We live in a time where everything competes for attention, where thoughts don't stop, where worries accumulate, and where silence has become rare. And in this scenario, many begin to believe that God is not speaking, when in fact, the problem is not God's voice, but the inability to perceive it in the midst of so much noise. The overloaded mind loses sensitivity. When there is too much information, too much anxiety, too much distraction, the interior becomes confused. It's like trying to hear a whisper in the midst of a screaming crowd. God continues to speak, but perception is blocked. And that's exactly why honoring God in the mind also involves learning something that seems simple but is deeply spiritual: inner silence. Silence does not mean the absence of thoughts, but organization. It's about creating space. It is to reduce the excess so that the essential can be perceived. It is slowing down internally, even when the world continues to accelerate outside. Because God's voice does not compete for attention, it reveals itself in those who are willing to listen deeply. Elias lived this in a remarkable way. In a moment of tiredness, fear, and exhaustion, he sought an answer from God. And then came strong demonstrations, an intense wind, an earthquake, a fire. Everything seemed grandiose, impactful, worthy of attracting attention. But God was not in any of these signs. After all this, something almost imperceptible came, a still, delicate, soft voice, and it was there that God spoke. This reveals something that completely changes the way we seek direction. God will not always be in what is noisier, more intense, or more evident. Often, he manifests himself in silence, in detail, at the moment when the mind finally slows down enough to perceive. Maybe you're expecting a clear, strong, immediate answer. But at the same time, your mind has no room to listen. Thoughts racing, worries occupying everything, constant distractions. And in the midst of this, the voice of God passes, but finds no place to remain. Creating inner silence is a decision. It is choosing to stop for a few moments. It is turning off the excess. It is turning the attention inwards. It is in this place that peace begins to emerge, that clarity appears, and that direction becomes more evident. Not because God has begun to speak, but because you have finally been able to listen. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. And if, when you hear this, you feel that you need that silence, that peace that calms inside, turn it into a small attitude now. Declare in the comments, Lord, I receive your teachings. Write as a gesture of surrender, and also leave your like, because this message can reach someone who is in need of exactly the same peace today. There is a decisive point in the spiritual life which separates those who are carried away by thoughts from those who learn to govern them, and this point is called self-control. Because the truth is simple but hard to accept, if you don't lead your mind, it will lead you to places you didn't want to go. Emotions come, impulses arise, thoughts appear, but none of them should have authority over you. Many people believe that they have no control, that they are simply like that they think too much, feel too much, react too much. But this is not a sentence. It is a lack of spiritual training. The mind needs to be led firmly. It needs to be taught. It needs to be aligned every day. Honoring God in the mind is not just observing what is going on inside you. It is taking control with awareness and decision. Joseph is a powerful example of this. He faced situations that could easily overwhelm his mind. He was betrayed, sold, wronged, forgotten. And in each of these phases, he had real reasons to feed revolt, bitterness, a desire for revenge. But he chose something different. He did not allow circumstances to define his thoughts. He kept his mind aligned with God, even when everything around him seemed otherwise. And perhaps the strongest moment in this story is when he faced temptation inside Potiphar's house. It wasn't just an external situation, it was an internal battle. A momentary impulse could change everything, but before any action, there was a decision within the mind. He chose not to give in. He decided to honor God in the place where no one was seeing. This reveals something profound. Self-control is not the absence of will. It is a decision above will. That's when you feel it, but you don't surrender. It's when you think, but choose to reject. That's when emotion screams, but the truth speaks louder. And this does not happen by chance. It is the result of a trained, strengthened mind, aligned with God. Maybe you've experienced moments when you reacted without thinking, said what you didn't want, felt what you shouldn't, and then realized that it could have been different. This shows that there is a space between thought and action. And it is exactly in this space that self-control needs to act. Better is he that tarrieth to anger than the mighty, and he that controlleth his temper than he that taketh a city. Proverbs 16:32. Mind control is one of the greatest spiritual achievements one can achieve. Because when you rule what happens inside you, what happens outside starts to lose its power to shake you. And if that message is finding space within you right now, as if it's bringing you a new consciousness, don't ignore it. Perhaps God is calling you to a new level of control, of steadfastness, of spiritual maturity. And a simple way to participate in this is by helping this word to reach more lives. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications, because together we can bring this transformation to people who also need to take control of their own minds. There is a time in life when faith ceases to be comfortable and begins to be tested within one's own mind. It's not when everything is fine, but when thoughts start to arise, when doubts appear without warning, when fear tries to take up space, and circumstances seem to contradict everything you believe. And it is exactly in this scenario that many think they are losing their faith, when in fact they are being called to strengthen it. Because true faith is not the absence of mental conflict. It is born right in the middle of it. It is the decision to continue trusting, even when the mind has reasons to give up. It is to look within and perceive the chaos, but still choose to stand on what God has said. And this is not easy, because it requires a conscious, repeated, firm choice. Pedro lived this experience intensely. When he saw Jesus walking on water, something inside him responded with faith, and for a moment he did the impossible. He got out of the boat, stepped on something that would not support anyone, and started walking. But then something changed. The wind was still there, the waves didn't disappear. But his focus changed. He took his eyes off Jesus and began to observe the chaos around him. And it was at that exact moment that he began to sink. This reveals a principle that governs the mind. What you focus on determines what sustains you. As long as Peter had his eyes on Jesus, he stood firm. But when his attention was captured by circumstances, his stability was shaken. And this happens every day, silently. The mind begins to focus on the problem, on the fear, on the uncertainty, and little by little, faith begins to weaken. Maybe you're experiencing something similar right now. Thoughts that question, situations that seem unsolvable, feelings that try to convince you that it won't work. And in the midst of it all, there is a choice being made within you, even if you don't realize it. Where is your mind looking? What are you mind feeding? To honor God in the mind is to choose to stay focused on the truth, even when everything around you tries to prove otherwise. It is not ignoring reality, but deciding that it does not have the final word. It is to sustain the mind in what God has declared, even when emotions do not follow. You will keep him in peace whose mind is set on you, for he trusteth in thee. Isaiah 26:3. And maybe this moment isn't just about you. As you listen to this, someone may have come to your mind, someone who is also facing doubt, fear, or a hard time. Don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments and turn it into an act of faith. Because when you do that, you're not just watching, you're participating in something bigger, a chain of prayer that can reach exactly those who need it. There is a deeper level than simply trying to control thoughts, and perhaps this will completely change the way you have struggled so far. Because the goal was never just to resist, it was never just to avoid what's bad, it was never just to keep the mind in check. The true calling is to allow God's presence to dwell continuously within you, occupying that space in such a real way that thoughts begin to align naturally. When God occupies the mind, something changes without forced effort. Decisions begin to gain clarity, the heart calms down, and what once caused confusion is now resolved with discernment. Not because you have become stronger alone, but because you are now no longer alone within yourself. There is a presence guiding, adjusting, directing every detail. Daniel lived exactly that. He was in an environment completely contrary to his faith, surrounded by pressures, threats, and a system that did not recognize God. But even so, his mind remained steadfast. It was not because the environment was favorable, but because the interior of it was occupied by the presence of God. He had a routine, a constancy, a daily decision to keep his fellowship alive, and that underpinned everything. 3 times a day, he stopped. It didn't matter what was happening around him. He turned to God. This was not just a habit. It was a positioning. He was saying with his attitudes that his mind belonged to God, regardless of external circumstances. And that was what kept him firm, even in the face of the threat of the lion's den. Perhaps you are waiting for circumstances to change in order to have peace, to have clarity, to feel safe. But the truth is that transformation begins within. When God's presence occupies your mind, the environment may still be challenging, but you no longer respond in the same way. There is a stability that does not depend on what is happening outside. To honor God in the mind is to transform your interior into a place where He feels good to stay. And this happens through constant small decisions. A moment of sincere prayer, a time in the Word, a choice to turn your attention to God in the middle of the day. It is these details that build a mind inhabited by the divine presence. And when this happens, peace ceases to be something rare and becomes a base. The direction is no longer confusing and becomes clear, and life begins to flow with a purpose that once seemed distant. You, O Lord, will keep in perfect peace him whose purpose is steadfast, because he trusts in you. Isaiah 26:3. None of this is by chance. If you have come this far, there is something being prepared within you, something that will still reveal itself in a deeper way. So stay until the end, because what comes next may be exactly the answer you have been silently seeking, even without being able to explain it. There is a dimension of spiritual life that many ignore, because they are accustomed to seeking direction only in visible signs, external circumstances, or obvious confirmations. But the deepest form of divine direction begins before any step is taken. It starts within the mind. God does not only guide paths, He guides thoughts. And when this is understood, everything changes. Before a decision becomes action, it has already been thought out. Before a path is taken, it has already been considered internally, and it is exactly in this invisible place that God wants to act, planting impressions, bringing convictions, and directing silently. The problem is that many ignore these internal signals because they expect something more evident, more logical, easier to explain. But God's direction does not always follow human logic. Often it comes as a peace that makes no sense, a restlessness that cannot be ignored, or a silent certainty that does not depend on external evidence. And it is at this point that the mind must learn to discern what comes from God and what comes only from one's own limited understanding. Moises lived this process in a remarkable way. Before freeing an entire people, before confronting Pharaoh, before experiencing extraordinary miracles, something began within him. There was a discomfort, a perception that something was not right, an awareness of purpose that was gradually built. Even with doubts, even though he felt incapable, he could not ignore what was being generated in his mind. When God finally revealed himself in the burning bush, it was not the beginning of the direction, but the confirmation of something that was already being worked on internally. Moses tried to resist, tried to argue, tried to present his limitations, but God's leading was stronger than any insecurity. Because when God plants something in the mind, He also sustains the way for it to be fulfilled. And maybe you've experienced something similar, an idea that doesn't leave your mind, a direction that comes back again and again, a feeling that you need to do something, change something, adjust something. But at the same time, doubts, fears, and questions arise. And in this conflict, many end up ignoring what may be God's own direction. To honor God in the mind is to learn to pay attention to these impressions. It is not discarding that which brings peace, even when it defies logic. It is recognizing that not all direction will be comfortable, but it will be aligned with the purpose. And the more you learn to trust that, the clearer the path becomes. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Proverbs 3:5-6. There is a level of sensitivity that begins to develop when you allow God to participate in even your simplest thoughts. And little by little, What was once confusing begins to gain direction, not because everything has become obvious, but because you have learned to trust the silent voice that guides you from within. There is a type of wound that does not appear on the body, but influences everything you feel, decide, and live. It does not bleed on the outside, but manifests itself in repetitive thoughts, in silent insecurities, in memories that insist on coming back. And the most delicate thing is that many people get used to it, as if it were part of their identity, without realizing that they are carrying marks that God never wanted to remain. The mind has the capacity to store experiences, but it also has the danger of transforming pain into truth. A rejection can become a constant thought that you are not enough. A past mistake can turn into permanent guilt. A disappointment can generate a negative expectation for everything that has not even happened yet. And so, without realizing it, the soul is being shaped by lies that are repeated until they seem real. But God does not work only with what is visible. He reaches exactly this hidden place where the wounds were stored. And healing does not begin on the outside. It begins when the mind decides to stop agreeing with what has hurt it, because as long as pain continues to be fed by thoughts, it remains alive. But when God's truth comes in, something begins to change. The woman of the blood flow lived for years, carrying a condition that was not only physical, but also emotional and social. It was excluded, rejected, forgotten. Everything around her reinforced the idea that there was no longer a solution. But at some point, something different arose inside her mind. A simple thought, but full of faith. If I just touch, I will be healed. That thought changed everything. It wasn't a miracle that started on the outside. It was an internal decision that broke years of suffering. As everyone saw a crowd, she saw an opportunity. While many doubted, she believed. And that thought, apparently small, paved the way for a complete transformation. This reveals a powerful principle. Soul healing begins when you decide not to repeat the lies that hurt you anymore. When you stop feeding thoughts that diminish you and start embracing what God says about you. It's not an instantaneous process, but it's real. It is a path where God restores, rebuilds, brings light where there was pain before. Honoring God in the mind is also allowing Him to touch those areas that you may have avoided for so long. It is giving space for Him to heal what no one sees, but which influences everything. Because when the mind begins to be renewed, the soul finds rest. He healeth the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. And if that word has found a sensitive part within you, as if God is touching exactly where you need it most, don't ignore it. Maybe this is the beginning of something new. If you felt this, write in the comments, I trust in God. Even if it is in silence, this may be your first response to this healing process that has already begun within you. There is something happening silently in many people's lives, and you may recognize it without even realizing it completely. It's not a lack of faith, it's not the absence of God, it's distraction. The mind begins to be divided between so many things, so many concerns, so much information, that little by little what was once a priority is being left aside. And when you realize it, the connection with God is no longer the same. It doesn't happen all at once, it's subtle. One day without attention, then another, then a mind too busy to stop, to reflect, to pray deeply. And so, without realizing it, the spiritual sensitivity begins to diminish. What once touched the heart no longer has the same effect. That clarity that once existed begins to be lost in the midst of excessive thoughts. But there is a moment that changes everything. A moment when the mind stops, even for a few seconds, and something makes sense again. A silent awakening, almost as if you came to your senses. And that's exactly what happened to the prodigal son. He was distant, living a reality completely disconnected from what he once knew. But the turning point didn't start when he physically returned. It started when something changed inside his mind. The Bible says that he came to his senses. This means that, for an instant, he saw the truth. He realized where he was. He realized what he had lost. He realized that there was a way back. And even before taking the first step, the decision had already been made internally. The reconnection started in the mind. Maybe you haven't completely moved away, but you feel like something has changed, that the intensity is no longer the same, that the presence is not as perceived as before. And that doesn't mean that God has stepped aside. It just means that your mind needs to be realigned again. Honoring God in the mind is also recognizing those moments and deciding to return. No matter how much time has passed, no matter how distracted you've been, the road back always starts with an internal decision. It's an adjustment of focus, a choice to reprioritize what really matters. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. James 4:8. There is something being restored within you as you listen to this, as if a forgotten part is being awakened again. And that's just the beginning. Don't stop now. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can further deepen this reconnection and bring a clarity that you may not have felt in a long time. There is a sense of urgency that few can perceive, because it does not make noise, does not appear visibly, but directly influences the way you live and think every day. It is the awareness that the spiritual life cannot be treated carelessly, especially when it comes to the mind. Because while many are distracted, thoughts are being formed, decisions are being prepared, and paths are being defined in silence. Negligence in the mind is never neutral. When you stop watching, something occupies that space, and this something does not always come clearly or dangerously at first glance. Sometimes they are small distractions, seemingly harmless thoughts, but which, over time, weaken your spiritual sensitivity. And when you realize you are no longer so attentive, you are no longer so firm, you are no longer so aligned, that is why Jesus brought such a direct message about surveillance. He didn't say this by chance. He knew that there would be times when the mind would be the main battleground, where invisible decisions would have eternal consequences. And it is in this context that the parable of the 10 virgins reveals something profound. They were all waiting, they all had lamps, they all had a similar appearance, but not all of them were prepared. The difference was not in what was visible, but in what was missing internally. Some had enough oil, others did not. Some were ready, others were unprepared, and when the time came, there was no time to correct what was neglected. This shows that preparation does not happen in the hour of need. It happens before, in a constant, silent, disciplined way. Applying this to the mind, the message is clear. Don't wait for difficult times to try to organize your thoughts. Don't wait for crises to seek alignment. Surveillance needs to be daily. It is a state of consciousness where you observe what is allowing it to grow within you, where you keep your mind awake, sensitive, and aligned with God. To honor God in the mind is to live with this spiritual readiness. It is understanding that every thought matters, that every internal decision has weight, that every silent choice can bring you closer or further away from the truth. It is not living in fear, but with awareness. It is not living in tension, but in attention. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Matthew 25:13. And perhaps, as you hear this, you will realize that God has been patient with you, giving you opportunities to adjust, to align, to get back into focus. That in itself is a proof of His goodness. If your heart recognizes this now, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word carries deep recognition and can awaken others to see how much God has been present, even in the quietest details. There is a transformation that does not need to be announced. explained or defended with words, because it reveals itself through the way you live. It is when the mind begins to be aligned with God in such a deep way that it naturally overflows in attitudes, reactions, and even silence. People may not understand exactly what has changed, but they realize that something is different, because everything starts in the mind, but never ends in it. Thoughts shape behaviors, and behaviors reveal what's going on inside. You may even try to hide, disguise, or control externally, but sooner or later, what occupies your mind manifests. And when God occupies this place, the reflection is inevitable. Maybe you've already met someone like that. A person who transmits peace even in difficult moments, who responds calmly where many would react aggressively, who demonstrates firmness without having to prove anything. This is no coincidence. This is the result of a transformed mind, of someone who has allowed God to rule his thoughts continuously. Stephen lived it in a way that defies any human logic. He was facing an extreme situation, being unjustly accused, surrounded by people full of hatred, about to lose his own life. And at that moment, when anyone would react with fear, revolt, or despair, something different happened. His mind was so aligned with God that his words reflected grace, forgiveness, and peace. He did not respond with accusations. He did not try to defend himself desperately. He did not let the environment determine his reaction. On the contrary, he looked up at the sky and kept his mind connected to something bigger than that situation. And in the midst of the pain, he released forgiveness. This does not come from human strength. It comes from a mind that has been completely transformed by the presence of God. This is the level that many wish to reach, but few understand the path. It doesn't start at the moment of crisis. It starts much earlier, in the daily choices, in the thoughts you feed, in the truths you decide to believe. It is in the secret of the mind that this transformation is built little by little until it becomes visible to everyone around. To honor God in the mind is to live in such a way that, even without saying a word, your life speaks. May your attitudes reveal something different. May your reactions show balance. May your presence carry peace. It's not about perfection, but about continuous alignment. It is allowing the mind of Christ to be formed within you until it becomes natural. But we have the mind of Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:16. And if you are realizing that this transformation is possible, even if it still seems far away, continue. There is a process going on, even if you don't see everything clearly right now. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can take you to an even deeper level of this change, something that not only you will feel, but that everyone around you will also notice. There is a silent question that accompanies many people throughout their lives, even if it is not always said out loud. Why am I here? What is the purpose of all this? And the most curious thing is that this answer does not start from the outside. It is not only in opportunities, paths, or circumstances. It begins within the mind. Many live in confusion, not because they lack capacity, but because they lack alignment. The mind is full of disconnected thoughts, outside influences, comparisons, fears, and expectations that didn't come from God. And in this scenario, even if there are clear opportunities, the direction seems blurred. Because when the mind is not aligned, even what is simple becomes confusing. But when the mind begins to align with God, something changes in a profound way. Thoughts begin to gain clarity, decisions start to make more sense, and what once seemed lost begins to organize. It is not that everything is revealed at once, but there is a direction that begins to form, like a path that becomes visible step by step. Jeremiah lived this call intensely. Even before he was born, God had already established a purpose for his life. It shows that purpose is not something you create, it's something you discover. But there is an important detail. Even after hearing this, Jeremiah had doubts. He felt incapable, unprepared, insecure. That is, the revelation already existed, but the mind still needed to accept this truth. And that's exactly where many get stuck. God can even show, He can even direct, He can even confirm. But if the mind does not accept, if the thoughts continue to be stuck in limitations, the purpose does not flow. Because what you believe about yourself directly influences what you allow yourself to live. To honor God in the mind is to allow Him to adjust that perception. It is making room for Him to reveal not only what you should do, but who you really are. It is letting the truth replace insecurities. That identity in God overcomes the contrary voices that you have carried for so long. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Jeremiah 1:5. This means that your life is not a fluke, it is not a mistake, it is not a random outcome. There is a purpose, but it needs to be understood internally before it manifests externally. And this understanding begins when the mind surrenders, aligns itself, and begins to see life from God's perspective and not from human limitations. There are times when the biggest battle doesn't happen on the outside, but inside the mind itself. It's when everything seems heavy, when thoughts pile up, when anxiety starts to tighten and peace seems distant. And the most difficult thing in these moments is that many times no one sees it. On the outside, everything remains normal, but inside there is a constant, silent, exhausting conflict. The mind, which should be a place of direction and balance, becomes a space of restlessness. Thoughts repeat themselves, worries increase, memories hurt. And the more you try to solve it yourself, the more you seem to sink into this cycle. It is at this point that many feel tired, not knowing how to find real relief. But there is one truth that changes everything. God does not ignore these internal battles. He is not distant when His mind is overloaded. On the contrary, it is exactly in this place that He wants to enter, bringing a peace that does not depend on circumstances. But this consolation does not happen automatically. It needs to be sought. Anna experienced a deep pain that no one could solve. His anguish was not only external, it was internal, constant, intense. Her mind was filled with sadness, frustration, and an emotional weight that was hard to explain. And for a while it seemed that nothing changed. But there was a moment when she did something different. She didn't try to endure it on her own anymore. She took everything to God. And that moment was not superficial. It was sincere, profound, true. She poured out her soul, opened her heart, exposed her pain without reservation. And something happened there that many don't immediately notice. Even before the situation changed, her mind changed. The Bible says that after that meeting, she was no longer sad. This reveals a powerful secret. The peace of God does not depend first on external change, but on internal transformation. When you truly surrender, when you put before God what is consuming you, something begins to reorganize itself within you. Anxiety loses strength, weight decreases, the mind finds rest. Honoring God in the mind is also that. It's recognizing that you don't have to carry everything yourself. It is understanding that there is a place where your worries can be delivered, where your thoughts can be calmed, where your soul can find real solace, casting all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. And if in some way this message has brought you even a small relief, it is already a sign that God is touching your mind right now. And just as you are receiving this, there are many other people in need of this same peace. By interacting with this video, you help that word get to where it needs to go. So if you want to be part of it, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because together we can bring comfort to those who are facing battles that no one sees. There is a way for God to speak that does not immediately attract attention, that does not make noise, that does not interrupt everything around, but that manifests itself in a subtle way within the mind. And the problem is not that God is not communicating. It's just that we often lack sensitivity to perceive, because not every answer comes obviously, nor is every direction accompanied by grandiose signs. Sometimes God speaks in details that go unnoticed by a distracted mind. Have you ever had the feeling that something inside you was directing you, but at the same time the doubt arose if it was just a common thought? This is one of the most delicate points of the spiritual life. To distinguish what is just coincidence from what is divine direction requires attention. It requires practice. It requires a mind that is not dominated by excess noise, because God often communicates through impressions. A peace that arises without explanation, a discomfort that insists on remaining, an idea that comes back again and again, a direction that seems simple but carries a different conviction. And those who do not develop sensitivity end up ignoring these signs, treating as something common what could completely change a path. Gideon experienced exactly this conflict. When God called him, everything inside him pointed to insecurity. He didn't see himself as someone capable. He didn't feel prepared. He didn't understand how that would be possible. And even as he listened to the direction, his mind needed confirmation. Not because God was absent, but because he was still learning to trust, and God, in his patience, confirmed it, not once, but several times. He answered Gideon's requests, strengthened his mind, brought signs that increased his confidence. This reveals something important. God knows the level of each person. He does not require blind faith. He leads, teaches, confirms when necessary. But there is a responsibility to be attentive, because as sensitivity grows, the need for external signals decreases. The mind begins to recognize patterns, to perceive the way God moves, to identify what comes from him more clearly. And what used to generate doubt begins to become conviction. To honor God in the mind is to live in this state of constant attention. It is not ignoring the details. It is not despising small impressions. It is valuing what seems simple but carries spiritual depth. It is to understand that God is not distant, but active, present, communicating in ways that require a heart willing to notice. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show unto thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Jeremiah 33:3. And the more you respond to these little signals, the clearer the direction becomes. Because God doesn't just speak, he also teaches how to listen. There are times when the mind seems to find no stability in anything. Circumstances change, situations get out of control, and what once seemed safe begins to shake. And it is exactly in these moments that something essential is revealed. If the mind is not grounded in something greater, it is easily lost. Because when everything around you is uncertain, you need a truth that doesn't change. This is where God's promises come in. They are not just beautiful words or comfort phrases. They are anchors. And an anchor is only necessary when there is movement, when there is instability, when there is a risk of being carried away by external forces. Its function is not to stop the wind, but to prevent you from being dragged by it. The mind needs these anchors, because thoughts come and go, emotions fluctuate, circumstances change, but the promise remains. And when you internalize that, something starts to take hold inside you. It's not that problems go away, but they no longer have the power to completely destabilize you. Sarah lived in a situation where everything pointed to impossibility. Time had passed. The conditions were not favorable. Logic said that there was no more chance. And for a moment, even she doubted. But God's promise has not changed. What he had declared remained intact, regardless of what seemed real to human eyes. And that's the central point. The promise doesn't depend on circumstances to be true. It depends on the faithfulness of the one who promised. And when the mind begins to understand this, it stops relying only on what it sees and begins to stand on what has been said by God. Maybe today there are areas in your life that seem uncertain, situations that don't make sense, answers that haven't arrived yet. And in these moments, the mind tends to seek security in what is visible. But true stability comes when you choose to believe what God has already declared, even if it has not yet fully manifested itself. Honoring God in the mind is this. It is to bring to remembrance what He has promised. It is to repeat these truths until they become stronger than any doubt. It is to use the Word as a foundation, as a basis, as a point of support when everything seems unstable. Faithful is what He promised. Hebrews 10:23. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is a specific area of your life where you need to get grounded again, where your mind needs to be reminded of what God has already said. If this is happening right now, turn it into a simple but powerful statement. Write in the comments, God takes care of me. Because when you declare that truth, you're not just writing, you are strengthening your mind in that which never fails. There is a silent force that sustains the mind even when everything seems to fall apart, and that force does not come from circumstances. It does not depend on what you see, nor on what you feel at the moment. It is born from something deeper, something that many lose without realizing it. Hope. Not a fragile hope based on uncertain desires, but a hope based on God's faithfulness. Because when hope is weakened, the mind begins to surrender. Thoughts become heavy, discouragement finds space, and what once seemed possible begins to seem too distant. It is as if, little by little, the person stops expecting something good, as if accepting that things will remain the way they are. And this is one of the greatest spiritual dangers, because when hope dies, vision is also lost. But when hope is renewed, something rises up inside. Even without external signs, even without immediate responses, there is a force that keeps the mind steady. And this hope does not come from a human effort, it is nourished by communion with God. It is in relationship with Him that the mind is reminded that there is still purpose, that there is still direction, that there is still a future being prepared. Job lived through one of the most extreme scenarios anyone could face. He lost assets, lost family, lost stability, lost everything that could bring security. And through it all, his mind was pushed to the limit. There was pain, there were questions, there were moments of silence. But there was something that was not completely extinguished, the hope that God was still present. Even when everything seemed otherwise, he did not abandon this conviction. He didn't understand everything, he didn't have clear answers, but he chose not to break with God, and that sustained his mind. It was not the absence of pain that kept him steady, it was the presence of a hope that did not depend on circumstances. Maybe you're living in a time when some areas of your life seem unanswered, where the mind tries to convince you that nothing will change. But this is exactly where hope needs to be strengthened, not as a passing feeling, but as a spiritual decision to continue trusting. To honor God in the mind is to keep that expectation alive. It is not allowing discouragement to have the final word. It is remembering, even in silence, that God continues to act even when you do not see. Because what He began has not been forgotten. For I know the thoughts which I think of you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29:11. And maybe what you'll hear next is exactly what your mind needs to take another step, to strengthen itself in a way you didn't expect. Don't leave now. Stay until the end, because there is something being prepared to touch exactly this area that you have not yet been able to solve on your own. There is something that many people underestimate, but that has a direct and profound impact on the way you think every day. The people around you. The mind is not an isolated environment. It is constantly influenced by conversations, attitudes, examples, and even the emotional climate of the environments you frequent. And even without realizing it, you begin to absorb what is around you. No one remains neutral. Either you are being strengthened or you are being weakened. Either your mind is being fed with faith or it is being contaminated by doubt, fear, and negativity. And the most delicate thing is that this happens silently, gradually, almost imperceptibly. By the time you realize it, your thoughts have already been influenced by what you have allowed to be close to. Therefore, honoring God in the mind also involves external choices. Not just what you think alone, but who you walk with, who you share with, who you connect with. Because there are environments that drain your faith, and there are environments that strengthen your mind in a powerful way. The early church understood this deeply. They did not live in isolation, every man for himself, trying to stand firm on his own. There was fellowship, there was unity, there was a constant connection. They met, shared, prayed together, encouraged each other. And this not only strengthened his external actions, but also his internal convictions. When one was weak, another was strong to sustain. When someone doubted, another brought faith. When someone felt lost, another helped to remember the way. This type of relationship creates an environment where the mind is protected, aligned, and strengthened continuously. Perhaps you have already noticed how some conversations make you lighter, more confident, closer to God. And others do the opposite, bring heaviness, confusion, discouragement. This is no coincidence, it's influence. And what you expose yourself to the most ends up shaping the way you think. This doesn't mean walking away from everyone, but it does mean being intentional. Choose connections that edify, that pull you closer to God, that help you keep your mind aligned when you alone might not be able to. Because there are times when you need someone to remind you of what you already know, but forgot in the middle of the fight. Honoring God in the mind is also recognizing that you were not called to walk alone. There is strength in communion, there is protection in unity, there is growth in the right relationships. And when you connect with people who share the same faith, your mind finds an environment where it can stand firm. And let us consider one another to incite to love and good works, not leaving our congregation. Hebrews 10:24-25. And the more you position yourself in these environments, the more your mind gets stronger, the more your thoughts align, and the easier it becomes to stand your ground, even when challenges arise. There is a moment when something begins to move inside the mind in a different way, like a discomfort that cannot be easily explained, a restlessness that does not go away even when you try to ignore it. It's not ordinary anxiety. It's not just a passing thought. It's like something is calling you to a deeper level, but at the same time you can't define exactly what it is. This is one of the subtlest signs of God's call. It rarely begins with anything external, visible, or grandiose. Most of the time it starts inside the mind, as an awakening awareness, as a sense that you can't go on in the same way, as a direction that insists on coming back, even when you try to occupy your mind with other things. And the most challenging thing is that this call is almost always accompanied by fear, insecurity, and questioning. Because when God begins to work on the inside, He does not ignore your limitations. He confronts. It reveals something bigger, but at the same time it shows you that you're not ready on your own. And it is exactly at this point that many retreat. Esaias lived this intensely. When he had that encounter with God, the first reaction was not trust, it was recognition of his own limitation. He saw himself as small, flawed, incapable. But at the same time, something was happening inside him. There was a consciousness being formed, a realization that this moment required a response. And then came the question, to whom shall I send? It was not an imposition, it was an invitation. And before any action could take place, before any mission was started, something had to happen inside Isaiah's mind. He decided, he answered, he said yes. That yes was not just a word, it was an internal position. It was the decision to go beyond fear, to not allow insecurity to have the final word. And that's exactly how God's call works. It starts within you, but it needs an answer that also comes from within. Maybe you're living in that moment right now. A sense that something needs to change, that there is something more, that you can't keep ignoring what has been popping up in your mind over and over again. And at the same time, there are doubts, fears, thoughts that try to make you retreat. But honoring God in the mind is this. It is to recognize this call and respond internally, even before any external step. It is to say yes in the place where no one sees. It is to position oneself within oneself. It is to allow God to lead what is not yet clear. After this I heard the voice of the Lord, saying, "Whom shall I send, and who shall go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." Isaiah 6:8. And maybe that's an important time not only for you, but also for someone who needs prayer right now. If there is something in your heart that needs divine intervention, don't keep it to yourself. Write your prayer request in the comments, with sincerity, with faith. Because when people come together in purpose, something starts moving in ways that you can't see, but you can feel. There is a kind of confusion that does not come from the world around us, but from within one's own mind. There are thoughts that intersect, opinions that mix, emotions that speak at the same time, creating a noise that is difficult to organize. And in this scenario, many begin to wonder how to know what really comes from God. Because the truth is that God keeps speaking, even when everything seems confusing. The issue was never God's silence, but the human difficulty of recognizing his voice in the midst of so many others. And this is not something that happens automatically. It is something that is learned, that develops, that is refined over time. God's voice does not manifest itself as other voices. It does not generate despair. It does not push for hasty decisions. It does not contradict the word itself. On the contrary, it brings a peace that often does not make immediate sense, but that sustains the decision. It is firm, even though it is soft, clear, even when she doesn't explain all the details. The problem is that when the mind is full of other influences, that voice can seem distant. Fear-based thoughts speak loudly, external opinions confuse, intense emotions try to dominate, and without discernment, everything is mixed, as if all voices had the same weight. Samuel lived this learning process. When God spoke to him for the first time, he didn't recognize it. He listened, but did not understand where it came from. He mistook God's voice for another reference he already knew. This shows that listening is not the same as discerning. The voice was there, but the mind still couldn't identify it. Guidance was needed, attention was needed, repetition was needed, until at a specific moment he finally understood. And when he understood, his answer changed. He positioned himself differently, with a real willingness to listen. This reveals an important principle. Spiritual sensitivity develops with practice and intention. The more you expose yourself to the Word, the more you seek God's presence, the more your mind adjusts itself to recognize what comes from Him. And what once seemed confusing begins to gain clarity. Honoring God in the mind is just that. It is not accepting confusion as a permanent state. It is to seek discernment. It is to filter thoughts. It is to learn to recognize patterns of the divine voice. Peace, coherence with the truth, firm direction. These are signs that are beginning to become evident to those who are attentive. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears, 1 Samuel 3:10. And as that sensitivity grows, something changes within you. Insecurity decreases, clarity increases, and what once seemed like an unorganizable noise begins to become a direction you can confidently follow. There is a profound difference between visiting God's presence at specific times and living consciously of it all the time. Many experience God on isolated occasions, in specific prayers, in specific situations. But they continue to conduct most of their thoughts as if they were alone. And this is exactly where something needs to change, because the mind only finds real stability when it understands that God is not only present in some moments, but in all. Awareness of God's presence transforms the way you think. When you start living as someone who knows you're not alone, your thoughts start filtering naturally. Decisions are made more carefully, reactions become more balanced, and even what you allow to remain in your mind goes through a new criterion. It's no longer just about what you want to think about, but about what's aligned with that constant presence. The problem is that many forget this throughout the day. They start well, with a moment of prayer, with an intention to stay connected, but as the hours go by, the mind gets lost in worries, distractions, pressures, and without realizing it, God is no longer remembered. Not because he has turned away, but because attention has been diverted. Enoch experienced something completely different. The Bible not only describes times when he sought God, but it states something direct and profound. He walked with God. This does not speak of an isolated event, but of a lifestyle. It means that in every step, in every decision, in every thought, there was a continual awareness of the divine presence. This reveals a level of intimacy that goes beyond the ordinary. It's not about doing more, but about being more aware. It is to transform the mind into a place where God is constantly remembered, where he participates not only in the big decisions, but in the simplest details of the day. To honor God in the mind is to live that way. It is to bring God into everyday thoughts. It is to remember him in the middle of the routine. It is to keep this connection alive even when everything is happening around us. It is developing a sensitivity that makes you perceive his presence not only at special moments, but at all times. Enoch walked with God, and he appeared no more because God took him to himself. Genesis 5:24. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is being awakened, as if God is calling you to a deeper level of closeness, something beyond what you have experienced so far. If this makes sense to you, write in the comments, God chose me, because recognizing this can be the beginning of a new way of living, where each thought starts to carry the awareness that he is present. There is a type of fatigue that is not solved only with physical rest. It's that wear and tear that starts in the mind, that steals clarity, decreases motivation, and makes even what was once simple seem heavy. And the hardest thing is that it can happen even to people who are walking with God, who are doing the right thing, who are making an effort. Because spiritual exhaustion does not choose the perfect moment. It comes when the mind oversteps its limits. Maybe you felt it, a feeling that he is trying to continue, but without the same strength as before. Slower thoughts, more difficult decisions, a willingness to step away, to stop, to simply not deal with anything for a while. And in this state, many begin to question themselves, as if there was something wrong with their own faith. But the truth is that even the strongest go through this. Elijah lived one of the greatest moments of spiritual victory, facing intense challenges and seeing God's action in a powerful way. But soon after that, something unexpected happened. It has sold out. His mind didn't keep up with the pace of what he had experienced, and he found himself gripped by fear, fatigue, and a deep desire to give up. This shows that the external spiritual force does not always reflect the internal state of the mind. It is possible to be firm on the outside and at the same time be exhausted on the inside, and it was exactly at that moment that God did not require more effort from Elijah. God did not demand more results. He did not ask for more strength. He took care of it. First, God allowed Elijah to rest, then he fed him, and only then did he begin to restore his mind, bringing direction again. This reveals something essential. Spiritual renewal does not begin with demand, it begins with care. God understands your limits, knows your weariness, and knows exactly how to restore your mind. Honoring God in the mind is also recognizing when you need to stop, when you need to seek renewal, when you need to come to Him not to produce, but to be restored. It is to understand that it is not weakness to admit fatigue, it is spiritual maturity. And when you turn to God in those moments, something starts to happen in a profound way. The mind is reorganized, strength returns, hope is rekindled. Not immediately, but really. Like someone who catches his breath little by little, but safely. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. Isaiah 40:31. And maybe, without realizing it, you got here carrying this fatigue in silence. But there is something being prepared for you beyond this wear. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be just what your mind needs to find rest and start strengthening again. There are thoughts that don't just appear once. They come back, insist, repeat themselves until they seem like part of who you are. It starts subtly, almost imperceptibly, but over time these thoughts gain strength, take root, and turn into internal structures that are difficult to break. And this is exactly how mental fortresses are born. They are not visible, but they are real. There are patterns that imprison, ideas that limit, internal voices that say that it won't work, that you are not capable, that nothing will change. And the more these thoughts are fed, the stronger they become, to the point where they begin to influence decisions, behaviors, and even the way you see yourself. Maybe you've tried to change that. You've decided to think differently, but you've realized that at some point everything comes back to the same place. This is because it is not just about willpower. Mental strongholds are not broken with human effort. They are overthrown with spiritual truth. Jericho was just like that. A city surrounded by high walls, seemingly insurmountable. There was no human strategy capable of overthrowing it in a common way. But God does not work within human limitations. He gave a direction that didn't make logical sense, but that carried a spiritual principle. The people did not attack as expected. They obeyed. They marched. They persevered. They trusted. And at the right moment, what seemed impossible simply fell. Not because their strength was greater, but because God was at the center of the strategy. This reveals something powerful about the mind. There are strongholds that you won't overcome just by trying harder, thinking harder, fighting harder in the same way. It is necessary to change the base. You need to bring God's truth to the center and directly confront what has risen up within you. To honor God in the mind is not to accept these invisible prisons as permanent. It is to identify patterns that repeat themselves. It is to recognize thoughts that do not come from God and replace them with the truth. It is to use the word as a weapon, as a reference, as a foundation. Because when the truth enters, what seemed strong begins to lose structure. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, for the pulling down of strongholds. 2 Corinthians 10:4. And perhaps as you listen to this, there is already a specific area of your mind that needs to be released, something that has been repeated for far too long. But just as those walls fell, this can also fall. And if this message has reached you now, it is no coincidence. Take advantage of this moment to strengthen yourself even more. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay connected. Because there are words that not only inform, but transform from the inside out. There is a deeper level of spiritual life that many people have not yet realized, because they are used to thinking only of their own struggles, their own needs, their own thoughts. But there comes a time when the mind ceases to be just a place of personal battle and becomes a conduit for something greater. That's when you start to realize that certain thoughts don't come by chance. They come as a call to intercede. Interceding is not just speaking words in prayer. It is to carry someone inside the mind before God. It is when a person comes to your mind insistently, when a situation occupies your thoughts in an unusual way, when something inside you feels that you need to pray, even without understanding all the details. This is no coincidence. This is spiritual responsibility, because God doesn't just talk to you about your life, He can also involve you in caring for other people, and that starts in the mind. A directed thought can become a powerful prayer. A sudden memory can be the beginning of divine intervention. But for that, sensitivity and willingness to respond are needed. Abraham lived this intensely when he learned what would happen to Sodom. He didn't ignore it. He didn't think only about himself. He didn't move away from the situation. He stood before God. And the most impressive thing is that his intercession was not superficial. He insisted, argued, stayed, carried that situation in his mind before God with responsibility and faith. This reveals that true intercession is neither quick nor distracted. It involves attention. It involves emotional charge. It involves a mind that stays connected with God while presenting something that needs intervention. It is a level of spiritual maturity where you understand that your thoughts can also serve a greater purpose. Perhaps you have experienced times when someone came to your mind for no apparent reason, or when you felt an impulse to pray for something specific, and many times this is ignored, treated as something common. But when you start paying attention, you realize that these moments carry a deep spiritual meaning. Honoring God in the mind is also that. It is not to despise these directions. It is to use your thoughts as instruments of intercession. It is to make yourself available for God to use you even in the invisible details. Because while many see only thoughts, God sees opportunities to act through someone willing. Far be it from me that I sin against the Lord, ceasing to pray for you. 1 Samuel 12:23. And as you develop this awareness, your mind ceases to be just a place of internal conflicts and becomes a space where God also reaches out to other lives through you in a silent but profoundly powerful way. There is a part of obedience that almost no one sees because it does not happen first in attitudes but within the mind. Before any external decision, before any visible change, there is a quiet moment where everything is defined. It is there in the countryside that the real struggle takes place. And that's why many people even do the right thing on the outside, but remain conflicted on the inside. Because obeying doesn't start with what you do, it starts with what you accept inside your mind. It is when God's will clashes with His own will, with His desires, with His plans, with what seems most comfortable or most logical. And at this point there is no audience, there is no recognition, there is only one internal decision. Jonas lived exactly this conflict. When he received God's direction, he did not immediately respond with obedience. On the contrary, he resisted. And this resistance did not begin with an external action, it began in the mind. He disagreed, he questioned, he tried to find another way. Before physically fleeing, he had already internally decided not to obey. This reveals something profound. Disobedience doesn't start when you act. It starts when you decide not to align your thoughts with what God has asked. And often this resistance is subtle. It is not a declared no, but a postponement, a justification, an attempt to adapt God's direction to one's own will. But there is also the other side. There is the moment when the mind surrenders. And when that happens, everything changes. Jonas went through a process to get to this point, but when he finally decided to obey, the path was transformed. What once seemed heavy became direction. What used to generate escape has become purpose. Honoring God in the mind is just that. It is choosing to obey before even acting. It's aligning your thoughts with God's will, even when it's not comfortable, even when it doesn't make complete sense, even when it challenges your preferences. Because when the mind positions itself correctly, actions become consequence. And there is something important in all this. God does not only seek external actions, he looks inward. He sees the willingness, he sees the intention, he sees the moment when you decide to say yes within yourself. And this moment is what really defines the course of your life. Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. 1 Samuel 15:22. And perhaps at this very moment, there is something that God has already spoken to you, something that has come back to your mind more than once, something that you are still processing internally. Don't ignore it, because the decision you make within yourself now can completely change what happens from here. Not many people will understand this level of depth, but if you are here, it is because there is something being dealt with directly with you. Remain attentive, because what is yet to be revealed can clarify what you have not yet been able to resolve within your own mind. There is a silent root behind many thoughts that limit you, and it is not in the circumstances, nor in the people, nor in the situations you have lived. It is in the way you see yourself, because the way you think is directly connected to the identity you believe you have. And when this identity is distorted, the mind begins to produce thoughts that do not reflect God's truth. That is why so many lie trapped in feelings of inferiority, constant fear, insecurity, and confusion. It's not a lack of capacity, it's a lack of understanding about who they really are. When someone does not know their identity, any outside voice gains strength. Any difficult situation feels bigger. Any challenge becomes impossible. But when the identity is adjusted, the mind changes. Thoughts begin to align, decisions become firmer, and what once generated doubt begins to lose ground. Because you stop thinking from your limitations and start thinking from what God has declared about you. Gideon is a clear example of this. When God found him, he was in hiding, trying to survive in the midst of fear. The way he saw himself was small, limited, worthless. But God did not speak based on the reality that Gideon saw. God called him valiant. That didn't make sense at that time. Nothing around confirmed that. But God was revealing an identity that Gideon had not yet understood. And the process that came after was not just about winning external battles, but about aligning the mind with this new truth. Because as long as Gideon continued to see himself as weak, his actions would always be limited. But as he began to accept what God said, his mind was transformed. And when his mind changed, his attitudes followed. This shows that the biggest block is not outside, it is inside. As long as you believe in a distorted version of yourself, your thoughts will reflect that. But when you begin to accept the identity that God declares, something begins to rearrange itself in a profound way. To honor God in the mind is to think according to that identity. It is rejecting thoughts that diminish you, that paralyze you, that take you away from what God has already said about you. It is choosing to believe, even when you still do not see everything manifesting. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. 1 Peter 2:9. This is not just a phrase, it is a truth that needs to be internalized. Because when you understand who you are, your mind stops oscillating so much. And what once seemed confusing begins to gain direction. Because now your thoughts are aligned with what God has already established from the beginning. There is a level of spiritual authority that many look for in the words they say, or the actions they perform, but completely ignore where it really begins, in the mind. Because before any external manifestation, there is an internal positioning. And if this position is not firm, any situation can shake, any doubt can weaken, any circumstance can deviate from the path. Authority is not born from what you do, it is born from what you believe. And this happens in the field of thoughts. When the mind is aligned with God, there is a different steadfastness. It's not arrogance, it's not stubbornness, it's conviction. It is a silent certainty that sustains decisions, even when everything around seems uncertain. Josue lived this moment intensely. He was given a mission that required more than physical strength. It required mental stability. He would have to lead an entire people, face challenges, deal with pressures, and assume a role that was previously occupied by someone who marked a generation. And in light of this, God did not start talking about external strategies. God spoke about the mind. Again and again he said, "Do not be afraid, do not be dismayed, be of good cheer." This was not just emotional encouragement, it was spiritual direction. God was preparing Joshua's mind to sustain what was to come, because without a steady mind he would not be able to stay on the path. And that remains true today. Many people even start well, but don't stay because their mind fluctuates. One day they trust, the next they doubt. One moment they believe, the next they retreat. And this instability prevents them from moving forward with authority. To honor God in the mind is to develop that steadfastness. It is learning to reject thoughts that weaken, that generate doubt, that try to take you away from what God has already declared. It is not ignoring reality, but it is choosing not to allow it to carry more weight than the truth. When you start thinking with that authority, something changes. Your decisions are no longer based only on what you feel and are guided by conviction. Your posture in the face of situations is strengthened, and what once shook you begins to lose strength. Didn't I send you? Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. And perhaps, right now, there is something in your life that is demanding just that of you. A firmer, more aligned, more convinced mind. If this word is confirming something inside you, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Because stating this is more than a phrase, it is a position that strengthens your mind and brings you closer to what God is already leading. There is something that sustains the mind even when emotions vary, when the days are not the same, and when motivation does not keep up. That something is not momentary spiritual intensity, it is not that strong impulse that comes and goes. It is discipline. And this is one of the keys most ignored by those who want to honor God in their minds. Because many believe that living well spiritually depends on feeling the will, being inspired, and living strong moments. But the truth is that the mind is not strengthened by spikes, it is strengthened by constancy. It is the repetition of small practices, done daily, that creates a solid foundation capable of sustaining you even on the most difficult days. Without discipline, the mind oscillates. One day it is firm, the next it is weak. One moment full of faith, the next dominated by doubts. And this instability impedes growth, because everything that is not constant is not consolidated. Everything that depends only on emotion does not sustain itself for long. Daniel understood this in a profound way. He did not build his spiritual life in isolated moments, but in a constant routine. 3 times a day, he prayed. It didn't matter what was happening around me, it didn't matter the environment, it didn't matter the pressure. That was not a reaction, it was a habit. And when the decree was issued forbidding prayer, Daniel did not change. He didn't negotiate, he didn't adapt, he didn't decrease. He kept doing exactly what he always did. This reveals something powerful. His mind was already trained. He didn't have to work hard to be faithful at that moment because he was already living like that every day. This is the point that many do not realize. Discipline builds a mind that remains firm when pressure comes. It is not at the moment of difficulty that you develop stability. It is before. It's in the secret, it's in the routine, it's in the silent constancy that no one sees. Honoring God in the mind requires this kind of commitment, not only when it is convenient, not only when there is a will, but every day. It is choosing to feed the mind with the Word. It is setting aside time for the presence of God. It is maintaining an ongoing connection that strengthens the interior. And little by little, something begins to change. The mind stops oscillating so much, faith becomes more stable, thoughts align more easily. Not because everything has become easier, but because you have become more steadfast. A faithful man will be covered with blessings, but he that is hastening to get rich will not go unpunished. Proverbs 28:20. Daily faithfulness may seem simple, even small, but it is what builds an unshakable mind, capable of remaining aligned with God in any circumstance. There is one area of spiritual life that cannot be ignored, because it defines the level of depth of your communion with God: purity of mind. Many wish to feel God's presence more, to have more spiritual clarity, to better perceive the direction, but they do not understand that all of this is directly linked to what is allowed to remain within the thoughts. The mind is not neutral. Everything that comes in leaves a mark. Everything that is repeated gains strength. Everything that is accepted begins to influence. And when the mind begins to be filled with content that does not come from God, something subtle happens. Spiritual sensitivity decreases. What was once clear begins to get confused. That perception that was once clear begins to weaken. It's not that God moves away. It is the mind that loses the ability to perceive. And this happens because contaminated thoughts create a kind of invisible blockage. Not immediately, but gradually. Small concessions, small deviations, small contents that seem harmless, but that gradually take up space and alter the internal environment. Hence, honoring God in the mind requires constant vigilance, not just in what you do, but in what you allow yourself in, what you see, what you hear, what you consume daily. All this forms the environment where your thoughts develop. And if this environment is not filtered, the mind begins to absorb that which weakens. Job understood this deeply. He not only sought to live rightly outwardly, he made a covenant with his eyes. This means that he consciously decided to protect what entered his mind. He knew that what begins in the gaze can become thought, and thought can become something greater. This attitude reveals a high level of spiritual responsibility. It's not just reacting to the mistake, it's preventing it from having space. It is anticipating, filtering, rejecting before it grows. Because when the mind is protected, the spiritual life is naturally strengthened. And perhaps this is one of the most challenging points, because no one sees it. There is no recognition, there is no applause, there is no external validation. It is a silent choice, made in secret, where only you and God know what is happening. But it is exactly in this place that true holiness is built. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:8. Seeing God is not only something future, it is also a present perception. It is being able to discern, feel, recognize His presence clearly, and this is directly linked to purity of heart and mind. Because the cleaner this space becomes, the freer it is to realize what really matters. There are thoughts that arrive like true giants within the mind. They don't appear lightly, they come with force, with repetition, with a weight that seems hard to ignore. These are thoughts that say that you won't make it, that nothing will change, that the fear is greater, that the situation is lost. And the most challenging thing is that many times they come back several times, as if they wanted to convince you by insistence. And this is exactly where something essential comes in: spiritual courage. Because facing these thoughts is not just a matter of logic, it is a decision not to surrender. It is to look at what seems big inside the mind and choose not to bow down, even when the pressure is constant. Many believe that the problem is having negative thoughts, but the real danger is accepting them as truth, because when you start agreeing with them, they gain space, and the more space they gain, the stronger they become, until, without realizing it, they begin to dominate the way you see everything. David faced something very similar, but in a visible way. Goliath was not just a physical enemy, he represented fear, intimidation, psychological pressure. Everyone around David saw the size of the giant and felt incapable. Their minds were already defeated before the battle even began. But David did not look the same way. He did not ignore reality, but he also did not allow it to define his reaction. While everyone focused on the size of the problem, he focused on who God was, and that made all the difference, because the battle began long before the stone was laid. It started in the mind. If David had accepted the same thoughts that dominated others, he would never have moved forward, but he chose to resist. He chose not to align himself with fear, not to accept intimidation, not to agree with what seemed obvious. And this internal decision was what paved the way for the external victory. This shows that many of the giants you face today are not outside. They are inside your mind. Thoughts that try to stop you, weaken you, convince you that it's not worth continuing. And the question is not whether they will appear, the question is how you will respond. To honor God in the mind is not to bow to these thoughts. It is to confront them with the truth. It is to resist with faith. It is to remain firm even when the pressure is great. Not because you don't feel it, but because you decide not to surrender. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Psalm 27:1. And perhaps there is a specific giant that has been rising inside your mind lately, something that seems bigger than you care to admit. But that doesn't define the outcome. What defines it is the position you choose to take in the face of it. And in the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can completely change how you face these internal battles. Stay tuned, because this might be just what you needed to hear today. There is a clear difference between reacting and discerning, and this difference defines the level of maturity of the mind. Many live reacting to thoughts, emotions, situations, as if they were always responding to what happens around them. But when God's wisdom begins to rule the mind, something changes profoundly. You stop being driven by impulses and start being guided by understanding. Impulsiveness is born of a mind that has not been trained to pause, to evaluate, to filter. It is when you think something and already accept it, feel something and already react, decide something without considering God's direction. And this, over time, generates confusion, wear and tear, and decisions that could have been avoided. But divine wisdom takes the opposite path. It teaches the mind to stop before acting, to observe before concluding, to seek understanding before deciding. It's not slowness, it's precision. It is the ability to see beyond the immediate, to perceive what is not evident, to make decisions based on principles and not just on momentary feelings. Solomon is a clear example of this. When he had the opportunity to ask for anything, he did not ask for wealth, nor power, nor victory over enemies. He asked for wisdom. This reveals a rare awareness, because he understood that if his mind was aligned with God's wisdom, everything else would be a consequence. And God responded in an extraordinary way. The wisdom that was given to Solomon was not ordinary. It was an ability to discern complex situations, to make fair decisions, to see beyond the surface. But this wisdom was not limited to major external decisions. She ruled the way he thought. This shows that to honor God in the mind is to allow that wisdom to lead to even the simplest thoughts. It is not accepting any idea that arises, but evaluating. It is not to react immediately, but to seek understanding. It is to develop a mind that does not get carried away easily, but that remains firm, balanced, guided. And there is an important detail. This wisdom is not exclusive. It is not distant. It is not inaccessible. It is available. But it needs to be sought. It needs to be desired. It needs to be applied daily. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. James 1:5. This means that at any time, in any situation, you can stop and ask for direction. You can seek clarity, you can ask for understanding, you can invite God to rule your thoughts, and when that becomes a habit, the mind starts to change, confusion subsides, impulsiveness loses strength, and a new way of thinking begins to take hold, not based only on what you feel, but on what God reveals. And this silent change is reflected in everything, because a mind governed by divine wisdom becomes a place of firm decisions, aligned thoughts, and safer paths. There is a silent danger that can settle in the mind without making a fuss, but which has the power to completely block spiritual growth: pride. It doesn't appear in an evident way most of the time. It doesn't present itself as something wrong, but as a false security, a sense of control, an idea that you already know enough, you already understand enough, you're fine as you are. And that's exactly what makes pride so dangerous, because when he enters, the mind closes. He stops learning, stops listening, stops correcting himself. And without realizing it, the person begins to rely on himself, on his own opinions, on his own conclusions, ceasing to depend on God in the details. But humility takes the opposite path. It opens the mind. She recognizes limitations, admits that there is still much to learn, understands that without God there is no safe direction. And this kind of thinking creates an environment where God can act freely. The biggest problem with pride is not just the outward attitude, but the way it distorts thoughts. It makes the person believe that they are right even when they are wrong, that they don't need adjustment, that they don't need to listen. And this creates a type of self-deception that is difficult to perceive because it is accompanied by conviction. Jesus showed this clearly in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two men went to pray, but with completely different mentalities. The Pharisee was full of himself, confident in his own actions, comparing himself with others, convinced of his position. The publican, on the other hand, recognized his condition, did not exalt himself, did not try to justify himself. He just stood before God with humility. And the result was clear. It was not the most correct externally that came out justified, but the one who had the mind aligned with the truth about himself. This shows that God does not only respond to what we do, but to how we think before him. To honor God in the mind is to choose this posture daily. It is not allowing pride to build thoughts of self-sufficiency. It is to maintain a constant awareness of dependence, understanding that all direction, all wisdom, and all strength come from him. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. This means that humility is not weakness, it is spiritual positioning. It is what keeps the mind open to grow, to learn, to be guided. Because when you recognize that you need God in everything, your mind becomes a place where he can act with freedom, bringing direction, correction, and ongoing transformation. There is a powerful change that can happen within the mind without anything external needing to change first. It is when the focus is no longer on what is missing and starts to recognize what has already been given. And this change has a simple but deeply spiritual name: gratitude. The mind, when it is not directed, tends to fixate on what is incomplete. She realizes what has not yet happened, what has not yet arrived, what has not yet been resolved. And the more this pattern is repeated, the more dissatisfaction grows. Even in the midst of blessings, the feeling can be one of scarcity. Even though the mind has received something, it is still stuck in what it still wants. But gratitude interrupts this cycle. She repositions her gaze. She does not ignore the difficulties, but chooses not to allow them to be the center. When you begin to recognize what God has already done, something changes within you. The mind calms down, the heart aligns, and a different peace begins to emerge. The 10 lepers experienced an extraordinary miracle. Everyone was healed, everyone received what they asked for, everyone had their lives transformed. But only one returned, only one recognized, only one stopped, only one had the awareness to thank him. And this detail reveals something profound. The blessing was for everyone, but the mentality was different in just one. The others went on with their lives, focused on what they would do from there, perhaps already thinking about the next steps, the next achievements. But the one who returned had a different perception. He understood that before moving on, he needed to recognize it. This shows that gratitude is not automatic. She is a choice. It is a decision to stop in the middle of the routine, in the middle of the worries, in the middle of the plans, and recognize that God is already at work. And when this practice becomes constant, the mind begins to change. To honor God in the mind is to cultivate this kind of thinking daily. It is not allowing silent ingratitude to take place. It is remembering, even on difficult days, that there are still reasons to be grateful. Because gratitude does not depend on perfection in circumstances, it depends on spiritual awareness. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God. 1 Thessalonians 5:18. And the more you practice this, the more your mind gets stronger. Anxiety decreases, comparison loses strength, dissatisfaction ceases to dominate. And a more stable joy begins to emerge, not based on what is missing, but on what has already been released by God. And perhaps in the next few moments, something even deeper will be awakened within you, something that can completely transform the way you see your life and your spiritual walk. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared that can mark a new beginning within your mind. There is a moment in the spiritual journey when the greatest challenge is not to start, but to continue. Because starting something with faith, with motivation, and with expectation is something that many achieve. But standing firm when time passes, when nothing seems to change, and when the answers don't arrive at the expected pace, it requires a much deeper strength, mental perseverance. The mind, when it is not strengthened, begins to question. She watches time go by and begins to generate doubts. Will it really happen? Did I understand correctly? Is it worth continuing? And these thoughts, if not confronted, begin to weaken the initial conviction. This is where many give up, not because God didn't speak, not because the promise wasn't real, but because the mind couldn't stand the process. Because between the liberated word and the fulfillment there is a space called time. And it is exactly in this space that perseverance needs to be developed. Noah lived it in a way that few can imagine. God gave a clear direction, but the fulfillment was not immediate. There were no visible signs at the beginning. There was no constant external confirmation. There was no applause. There was only one instruction and a long period of silent obedience. Year after year, he kept going. Even without seeing rain, even without understanding all the details, even in the face of a scenario that did not confirm what God had said. This reveals something profound. His faith was not based on what he saw, but on what God had spoken. And that's the key to mental perseverance. It is keeping the mind aligned with the promise, even when the eyes cannot yet see. It is not allowing time to weaken what God has already declared. It's about continuing to build, even when it seems time-consuming. To honor God in the mind is to remain steadfast in this process. It's resisting discouragement. It's rejecting thoughts that try to make you stop. It's keeping believing even when everything seems silent. Because the silence of a process does not mean the absence of God. It often means that something is being prepared. Let us run with perseverance the career that is proposed to us. Hebrews 12:1. And maybe you're right there right now, between what God has spoken and what has not yet happened, between the promise and the visible reality. But this is not the end, it is the process. And if that word has found you today, don't ignore it. Receive this as a confirmation. If in your heart there is this certainty, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because declaring it can be the boost your mind needed to stay steadfast until the fulfillment of what God has already begun. After everything that has been revealed so far, it is clear that it is no longer possible to continue just reflecting. There comes a time when the mind needs to surrender, because understanding without surrendering does not transform, and listening without taking a stand keeps everything in the same place. What has been awakened within you now points to something deeper, the need to trust in a real way, not just with words, but with a heart totally open before God. The word itself reminds us in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This is not just a distant promise, it is a direct invitation, a call to step out of the weight of one's thoughts and into a place of peace that only God can offer. All that has occupied his mind, all that has given rise to doubt, weariness, or restlessness may now be set before him. This is the time to step out of theory and into presence, to transform each teaching into surrender, each reflection into living communion. Open your heart without reservations, without filters, and allow God to touch you exactly where you need it most. Let us now pray together, trusting that He is listening, that He is present, and that He has already begun to act. Beloved Father, your presence is the place where the mind finds rest, where thoughts are stilled, and where all that was confused begins to align. Today, we stand before you with open hearts, recognizing that we need your intervention, your direction, and your peace that goes beyond human understanding. Lord, we thank you for every word that has been released, for every teaching that has reached within, for every truth that has brought light to the mind. Thank you that even when we didn't realize it, you were already at work within us, adjusting thoughts, healing wounded areas, and leading us closer to your will. Your grace has sustained us this far, and your presence remains all we need. Now, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom. It strengthens every mind that is tired, renews every thought that has been worn out by struggles, and brings clarity where there is confusion. Teach us to think as you do, to see life from your perspective, and to stand firm even when feelings try to lead us astray. Give us discernment to reject that which does not come from you, and courage to remain in the truth, even when it is not easy. Lord, look at every need now. For those who are facing emotional battles, it brings peace. For those who are dealing with anxiety, it brings rest. For those facing financial difficulties, it releases provision. To those who are sick, pour out healing. For families that are broke, it allows restoration. And for those who feel lost, it reveals direction. May every area of life be touched by your powerful presence. At this moment, in silence, each heart opens before you. Each person presents their pains, their requests, their concerns, and trust that the Lord is listening. Father, we commend everything into your hands. We surrender our thoughts, our fears, our dreams, and everything we still can't control. May your will prevail in our lives, because we know that your plan is perfect, even when we don't fully understand it. Take control of our mind and establish your peace permanently. Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit. Psalm 51:10. May your peace guard every mind now. May your presence be constant, and may your voice be stronger than any other thought. We trust in you, rest in you, and we stand firm in your direction. In Jesus' name, amen. If this prayer touched your heart, write in the comments, amen. Along this journey, something very profound has been revealed. Honoring God in the mind is not just a distant spiritual concept. It is a daily practice that completely transforms the way you live, feel, and decide. Every thought you allow, every idea you feed, every direction you choose to go within your mind is building your future silently. And maybe now you'll realize that this message didn't come by chance. It is for you. God chose you to hear this today because there is something inside your mind that He desires to align, restore, and strengthen. The question that remains is simple but powerful. What are you going to do with all this from now on? Will you continue to allow misaligned thoughts to dominate, or will you take spiritual control of your mind and begin to honor God in every invisible detail? I am truly happy to know that you are here, walking together on this journey of transformation. There is something special happening when people choose to seek God sincerely, and you are a part of it. I want to invite you in a very simple way to take the next step. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and activate the bell to continue receiving these messages that strengthen faith. But beyond that, I want to meet you. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share what you have been experiencing. Their story is important, and together we can form a chain of faith where one strengthens the other in prayer. And it doesn't end there. There's something even deeper waiting for you in the next video. Because once you understand how to honor God in your mind, the next step is to learn how to live daily in His presence practically and steadily, even in the midst of life's pressures. There are details that have yet to be revealed, paths that have yet to be illuminated, and you don't want to miss that continuity. The next video is not just another piece of content, it's an extension of this transformation that has already begun within you. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.